So again, we're going to talk about how these different organizations can work together, how you leverage your work, how you maximize your how a C3 can maximize its lobbying activity because it is working with a C4, how to legally and effectively do that. That's what we're going to work on today. So I want to define a couple of terms for you: affiliated organizations versus coalition organizations. So affiliated organizations, these are individual organizations. They may have they'll probably have a common goal. They probably have a common vision of the future, but they have different tools or ways of achieving those goals. Because an affiliated organization, you'll see a 501(c)(3 and affiliated 501(c)(4). They are legally distinct organizations, but they're affiliated and legally connected by a cost sharing agreement. There are other overlapping elements. They may share some board members or some staff members. They may share other types of costs, like an office rent or things like that. They are legally distinct. They are financially separate, but they do share. They are related through their common visions and goals. And some examples are my organization. Alliance for Justice is a 501(c)(3. And we have AFJ Action, which is a 501(c)(4. And I happen to work for either organizations. I do, sometimes I'm working for AFJ Action, sometimes I'm working for Alliance for Justice. We are connected through affiliated, because we are affiliated. There's also others out there: LCV, League of Conservation Voters, Planned Parenthood, Jobs for Justice Education is a 501(c)(3. Jobs with Justice is a 501(c)(4). Each organization has its own tax status, but they have common visions for the future. But because of the different tax statuses, they have different tools or different ways they can achieve the goals for that vision. So a coalition is a little bit different. These may be like-minded organizations that come together in the short term or long term. There could be a long-term partnership, but there's really no overlapping legal structure or overlapping board or staff. Each org has its own tax status. You're coming together for a common goal, like you are today. You're all from different organizations, but you're all here in coalition, learning about working together, or learning about what is advocacy, or learning about what is election activity that you can undertake. These could be very informal structures like partnerships. Sometimes there are more formal structure that others join. For example, a ballot initiative campaign. There could be one common entity, one common organization that brings everyone else together. But the ballot initiative campaign is its own tax status. So these are individual groups that come together with a common purpose, just for temporary, or just it could be long term, but it's usually an informal, temporary operation. Usually there's some type of operational agreement or memorandum of understanding or a partnership agreement, but nothing as formal as an affiliation. So coalitions like this, like we have, A2, also like Lead Safe Cleveland. This is a coalition that includes citizens, individuals, residents, nonprofits, and then also members of the local government that are coming together to tackle safe drinking water issues, and to replace, the lead pipes. We the Action is a coalition of attorneys, that are working on different causes. There was the Funders Collaborative on COVID, uh, uh, funders, foundations, nonprofits came together to respond to the needs for you, because of COVID collaborative on COVID recovery. And then, of course, you have a lot of voting rights coalitions where nonprofits that work on democracy issues or voting rights will come together, have come together in different states. But these are examples of coalitions. So whether or not you are joining a coalition table, whether or not you have affiliated organizations, these principles, these are 4 principles that will guide your actions. And each of these is guided by and because of the tax status of the organization. Now, when I go through these, I'm going to look at this, or we're going to talk about this, looking from the C3 perspective, because the C3 is the one that is most restricted, because of its tax status, because it is tax exempt and tax deductible. It has the most restrictions upon it, the limited lobbying, the that it cannot do any partisan political work. Because it's most restrictive, we're going to look at these principles, and most of the rest of the presentation will be from the C3 perspective because of that. So the first thing is, it's real simple. You can only fund what you can do yourself. Any funds, assets, think about riding a bike. A 501(c)(4) wanting to give funds or assets, or paying for funds or assets, it's like riding a bike down the hill. Anything going from the C4 to the C3 is riding the bike down the hill, okay? Because the C4 can do that unlimited lobbying, because they can, because they're not tax deductible. It is easier for funds, assets, staff, data, anything to go from the C4 to the 501(c)(3. Ride that bike down the hill. Now, funds, assets, staff, other things, these things can go uphill from the C3 to the C4, but riding that bike is going to be slow, and you're going to have to be more deliberative. It is possible, but it's going to be, you need to be a lot more careful. And we'll talk about ways that could be. So here's an example. Let's say a C3 public charity. Some members of the board feel that they need an affiliated C4. You've really maximized everything that you can do out of your 501(c)(3, and you are looking to do more. So some of the board decides to separately establish a 501(c)(4. And it's important that when that C4 is built, any C4 is built, it cannot use C3 resources to build the initial infrastructure. It cannot build that infrastructure of the non-C3. So we say that the C4 needs to build its own table. It needs to establish itself away from the C3. The C3 cannot use its resources to create a C4. The C3, a few people can on their own start an affiliated C4, but the C4 must build itself. Now, a C3 can grant funds to a C4. It also could loan funds to its affiliated C4. There are specifics that it needs to follow, such as the fact that grants from a C3 to a C4 must prohibit any partisan political activity. It cannot be those funds cannot be used for fundraising. It may allow lobbying, but it will count against the C3's own lobbying limits. And there must be a report back and written agreement. We do have some of the materials that will follow up our presentation will include more information about grants and loans between C3s and C4s. Loans, again, you prohibit the partisan activity. If you allow for lobbying, it counts against the C3 lobbying activity. But a loan you could allow fundraising through a loan. And it must be done via commercially reasonable terms. And if you do a loan, the loan must be paid back. Have to pay back. You cannot forgive a loan between a C3 and C4. Another thing that we always get asked about is about list sharing or selling the list. Whether it's a volunteer list, whether it's the email list, whether it's a voter file, whether it's data. Data is a very high value asset right now, at this time. And so there are some ways that C3s and C4s could share list. So a C3 wanting to share, give, share, sell its list to another C3 is absolutely okay. You can exchange that list, you can sell that list, you could share your list. From a C3 to a C4, it has to be a fair market exchange. It has to be a one-on-one. You have to make sure that it's an absolute exchange, or the C4 must pay fair market value for it. Again, and then if a C3 wants to sell its list to a 527, remember the 527s are the political parties' campaigns. They have to sell it at fair market value, and they have to make it available to all political parties. Okay, they can't just sell it or arrange to sell it with one party versus the other. Now, again, if the flip side, on the downhill side of this, if a C4 or a C5 or 527 can give their list to the C3, it can in-kind that list. But the one thing it wants to do is to make sure that it is scrubbed any partisan data from that list, any notations on who these people would support or oppose. You want to scrub that list if you're a C4 giving your list to a C3 to use. You want to scrub the partisan data. You're allowed to have it, but the C3 cannot. And so it's just a good idea that the data has been scrubbed. C3s and C4s, if they're affiliated, can hold joint fundraisers. One of the things you want to do is to make sure that you have a written agreement on, whether there's a fair cost allocation and a division of funds raised, which organization is paying for what, and then how the funds will be divided based on that. The one thing you want to make sure is, because remember the C4 is not tax deductible, but the C3 is, you want to make sure that donors know the tax deductibility disclaimers. So they know that this is given to a C3 and a C4, and the C4 is non-tax deductible. So C4s will normally, the C4 should have on all of its donor materials, its donor sites, websites, that the contribution is not tax deductible. Um, that you need to make sure that the funders to these joint fundraisers know that. And then such as well as you don't want any partisan activity or any partisan fundraising going on with joint fundraisers. And then second is your tax exempt shadow follows you everywhere. When you're a C3, you are a C3 in a coalition. You are a C3 when you're affiliated. Wherever you are, if you're a C3 or a C4, your tax shadow, your shadow of what you're allowed to do and how your contributions are treated, that's your tax status shadow, and it follows you everywhere. Um, and this also a reminder that if you're a fiscal sponsored program, your fiscal sponsorship is your tax exempt shadow, right? Their rules are your rules. If your fiscal sponsor is a C3, then you are a C3. That's your tax exempt shadow. If their lobbying activity, their allowable lobbying is how much you can do, or how much they're allowing you to lobby, if they're allowing you to lobby, is part of their tax status. So you want to make sure that you are following your fiscal sponsorship agreement, because that's your shadow that you're going to take everywhere, whether it's at a coalition or an affiliation or anything like that. And so just a reminder that your tax status, it also follows you online. So, a lot of us use social media. Social media has been a good way, an inexpensive way to educate the public about our issues. Any rules that apply to print or verbal communications apply to social media and communications online, communications via text, anything like that. Uh, that's where your tax status shadow will follow you. It'll also follow you because on shared websites or other websites. So, for example, if a 501(c)(3) and a C4 share a website, then the organization is responsible for any content on that website. So, for example, if the C3 allows its C4 to share its website, the C4 should not be allowed to do any partisan political activity on that website because it's the C3 sites. And then if a C3 and C4 have separate websites, the C3 can link to the home page, but it should not link to any other page or any page that has partisan content by the C4. That should be a separate part of the content for the 501(c)(4) if the C3 is going to link to it. So anything that the C3, here we have the redistricting network, which was a national nonprofit. It reposted this post about citizens, not politicians post. This was a nonpartisan, it was about a ballot initiative. When you are retweeting, when you're liking, when you're sharing, whatever you're doing, as your tax status, it's as if you could have done it yourself. So the IRS will look at your tax status and see if you are reposting, you can only repost what your tax status would have allowed you to do originally. It is going to look at that repost as if you said it yourself. So you are responsible. Your nonprofit is responsible for any content that it reposts or tweets or links or shares or likes. So you want to make sure as a C3 that you're not liking any partisan content, even if it's an affiliated 501(c)(4. You want to keep the C4 can do that. It needs to keep that separate from the C3. So going back to lessons 1 and 2 or principles 1 and 2, keeping records to ensure that you're following your tax status, that you're funding what you can fund. Keeping good records is essential. It will help during any audit, any complaint. Now, unfortunately, there are really no specific accounting guidelines that the IRS states or blesses. It's just wants you to do a reasonably efficient best practices to track and allocate any resource or expense. You need to have a system that does that and follow that system. But there's no particular system that the IRS would state. You might want to check with a CPA. And there are nonpartisan guidelines on about record keeping. So one thing, especially with affiliation between a 501(c)(3) and C4, are the cost sharing agreements. And this is a agreement between a C3 and C4, or perhaps between other organizations, and it outlines how staff, overhead, assets will be shared or reimbursed, like data, like websites, especially staff. Staff is a can be an expensive but valuable asset, and whether or not this would outline whether or not staff are paid by the C4 and reimbursed by the C3, or paid for by the C3 and then reimbursed by the C4. You want to have a good cost sharing agreement. You want to Review that cost sharing agreement every couple of years or once a year to ensure that you are following it. Have the cost sharing agreement and follow it. Another thing is timesheets, especially for affiliated organizations. You want to make sure that you're tracking the lobbying activity. Who is doing that lobbying activity? Is this lobbying activity done by the C4? Is it lobbying activity that's done by the C3? Is it nonpartisan work? Is it nonpartisan voting work? Is it advocacy? Is it C4 partisan work? You want to be able to show where your staff, if you're sharing staff, are tracking accurately their time. You want to have a timesheet system. You also want to ensure that staff are trained on that system and that they are completing their timesheets. Now, I know everybody hates timesheets. I don't like them. I have to do them. I've had to in a past life, I had to pull teeth to get people to do their timesheets. But it is very important that they do timesheets and that they're kept accurately, because this is where the C4 or C3 is going to have to, the C4 has to pay its fair share of staff. It has to pay for its own program. So the last thing is, it's kind of all of our principles together, is that you're going to need to know what hat you're wearing. Staff are going to need to know what hat they're wearing, whether they are working for the C4, whether they are lobbying or undertaking advocacy, whether they're working for a political action. Basically, because you need to know, your organization needs to know, to be able to track what activity is being paid for, and if the right money has to pay for it. If you have a grant that doesn't allow you to lobby, then you need to make sure that you have other funds that allow you to lobby, and that staff know that they are lobbying and that they can use that money to pay for it, or that they are wearing their C4 hat. So staff training is very important. So everyone knows what role they need to undertake, and that the right funds are being used to pay for that activity. So let's dive in a little bit with a few different types of activities that you could do. You want to be able to, especially if you're an affiliation, you know, you when you're undertaking that program, you want to determine how things are going to be paid for, in consideration of our four principles, that, the uphill, downhill, your tax status, your tax shadow, tracking, keeping good records, and knowing which hat you are doing. What is the best nonprofit for the job, or which nonprofit should undertake what part of what program, especially if you're working together on a program. So a reminder that a C3 can undertake a lot of activity. It can do education activity. It can do non-lobbying advocacy. It can do some lobbying. Lobbying is limited, and know how much lobbying you can do. And then it can also do any nonpartisan election activity. Now, a C4 can do anything that the C3 can do. That's all primary purpose activity for the C4. And it can do unlimited lobbying activity, lobbying in an unlimited amount. And it can take partisan election, it can do partisan election activity, but that has to be done away from the C3. It can't be done by the C3. So the best practices is that when the C3 and C4 are working together, ensuring that the joint activity is always C3 permissible. So whenever you're doing an activity and you're sharing the logo, if you're sharing resources, making sure that that activity is C3 permissible. Your non-C3s, such as your C4, can engage in partisan activity, but they should do that away from the coalition. What are the pros and cons? A question, what are the pros and cons of moving from a C3 to a C5? Well, C5s are labor unions, but so what I think you mean is what is the C3 to a C4? I hopefully, or I'm going to answer it as a C4. I think what the advantages of that would be if you're undertaking your C3 activity and you are maximizing the education, the non-lobbying advocacy, if you're finding that you're lobbying, you're maximizing that lobbying limit, you're really doing everything you can out of that C3, but you need to do more, right? If you are maximizing your C3 and you still want to do more, you want to undertake some political activity. You want to have a harder voice. You want to do more lobbying because then the C4 can undertake that. So let's look at a couple of, I hope that answers your question. And I just want to show you a couple examples of this. So we're going to look at some specific activities, starting with advocacy. We know that C3s and C4s can advocate, and they can advocate and educate the public on issues. So they could do a joint issue campaign. Um, you know, uh, and these issue campaigns are not including lobbying. Remember, lobbying is just one small part of what is advocacy, okay? So a C3 can repost C4 messages that are nonpartisan or non-lobbying, and it doesn't count against their lobbying limit. Your C3 and C4 could work together on a nonpartisan issue advocacy strategy. You know, and remember, as always, since the C4s and others can do partisan activity, they need to move away from, they should be separate. They can do that separately from the C3. Also, and we'll talk about what makes something partisan or nonpartisan in just a few slides, but some issue campaigns will become riskier the closer you get to an election. And we'll talk about that. So it might be, you know, the C3 may consider, you know, dialing it back the closer you are to the election, but maybe a C4 will keep on because it can do that partisan election. So joint lobbying work is a great way that whether it's a ballot measure or lobbying in the state legislators, in the state legislator, where C3s and C4s can really work together. You know, coalitions can lobby jointly. The C3 sitting at the table, they've got a maximum amount that they can do. They're limited in the amount that they can do. But because you're limited, you know, working with other C3s on the same issue, working together with them, you know, you're adding up all of your limited lobbying, and together as a team, you can really maximize your impact when everyone is the phrase singing from the same choir book. Okay. And then you could have C4s in there, which can do more lobbying. But you're really getting more bang for your buck because you are lobbying together. Now you always need to remember what your tax status is and how much you can lobby, whether that's the C3 or whether that's the C4. Same thing with ballot measure campaigns. Um, Ballot measure campaigns count as lobbying for 501c3s. Usually, when a C3 is working on a ballot measure, you will have a ballot measure table. You will have one campaign that is the campaign that's likely going to be reporting the activity, you know, because it could be reportable via campaign finance. So there is a ballot initiative committee that's working on, you know, like pledge to vote yes for fair maps. The C3 could be part of that coalition, but it may be that the campaign is the actual one that is actually reporting to the state. And then, you know, you can always engage in GOTV and then and you can endorse support or opposition to any ballot measure, so long as you're not overlapping with any candidate advocacy. Okay, so oh, uh, Kevin, follow-up question talking about a Section 501's agricultural organization. That's true. So a C3 could work with the C5 in that manner, just as it could work with a C4. And again, I think the considerations would be the same, whether or not the C3 has really maximized. One of the things remember the C3 donations could be the tax status about the donations. You may find that a C5 doesn't have tax deductible donations. That may or may not play into that, but it's the same thought process that the C5 can engage in political activities, but it can't be its primary activity. So I think it's the same thought process. So one of the lobbying strategies when C3s and C4s are working together is that a C3 could grant its lobbying limit. It could give it a grant. It could allow it to use all of that money. Let's say that the C3 has $100,000 that's its limit for lobbying. It could grant to the C4 all of that. Could grant the C4 $100,000 to lobby. Because the C4s have no lobbying limit, it can take that $100,000 and it can really, it can be added to its unlimited and it can really maximize the amount of work that it can do. Also, remember the C4 could, the C3 could undertake lobbying, the C4 could undertake more lobbying. It could pay for some of the bigger expenses in the joint lobbying campaign. It could pay for the research. It could pay for the legislative lobbyists that cost that is going to, eat up the C3's lobbying limit. And so it could also take on, the lead and do the lobbying for the C3 because it's unlimited. And as well as sometimes having a C4 versus a C3, because the C3 is a trusted messenger in its community, it may fear taking on the hard-hitting issues. It may be leery of sticking its neck out there, sometimes with the hard messages that have to be done in a lobbying campaign. Well, maybe a C4 doesn't have to worry about that. And so that's another consideration. So one of the things is when you're doing a lobbying grant from a C3 to a C4, you want to make sure, and this is back to the downhill, uphill. This is the uphill. If the C3 makes a grant to the C4, it needs to specify that the amount of that it is allowing for grassroots lobbying or direct lobbying. It needs to absolutely specify that the funds are restricted from using for any partisan political purposes. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about election activities. This is important because, C3s have to be nonpartisan, C4s can be partisan. And even though it's not an election year, typically it's a 2025 is what we say is an off-year election. But however, there's always elections going on specifically in some states like Virginia, New Jersey. Some states have Supreme Court races. A lot of states have their mayoral races, their city council races in the odd years. It's always important to know whether or not, especially when you're working together on in order to not to be nonpartisan. We are C3. Can we subgrant to a tribe? They're neither a C4 or a C3. Um, oh, I'm sorry, that was a direct message. Let me stick a pin in that question. Uh, um, so I will get back to you when we're done here. But let me think about that. Okay, so when you determine whether or not something is partisan, whether a communication is partisan, whether it's a program that's partisan, it's actually a risk. It's a risk spectrum. You think about your risk, and whether or not because nothing is clear cut on whether or not it is partisan or nonpartisan. And so you have to think about who you're communicating with, why you are communicating with, who's the audience, what's the purpose, and why are you communicating now? Some of the factors that you need to look at to determine if something's nonpartisan is called the facts and circumstances test. Now, the C3 is going to look at this to determine whether or not they want to undertake the activity. The C4 is going to C4, C5, C6 is going to look at this to see if they need to do this as political activity or primary purpose activity. So some of the factors are that you're not referencing a candidate or an election. But you could be talking about an elected official, right? There's an external factor driving the timing. It's not the election. Let's say it's an exempt order, an executive order from the president. It is an unfortunate incident that has occurred, a natural disaster. School is out. School's about to start. There are an external factor outside of the election that is driving the reason why you need to talk now. You're also targeting a sector of the community that's unrelated to a candidate or the election. And you're talking about the core values of your organization. What makes something partisan is that you are referring to a candidate in their candidate capacity. You are talking about this because it's being motivated by timing. Something that is perfectly fine to talk about, an issue that is perfectly fine to talk about now, may be too partisan to talk about in September of 2026. You are comparing candidates with the organization's preferred position. Or you're talking about a specific community because it's going to influence whether or not a candidate is elected or not. This is not, I'm briefly going through this, some examples of where C3s and C4s can work together on nonpartisan activity. So here we have an example, LCV Education Fund is a 501c3. As you can see, they registered voters, nonpartisan email, online voter registration programs. LCV is the 501c4. They elect champions for climate and democracy. So here's where C3 and C4 can work together. They can work together on the nonpartisan efforts. They can work with affiliated C4s on those nonpartisan efforts, but the C4 can do its partisan political activity separate. No C3 money or staff time should be pulled into any partisan political activity. And this is specifically where your record keeping comes into play. One of the ways that an organization could get dinged or somebody could question your organization when they say a C3 is engaging in partisan political activity. And so that's a reason why you want to make sure that you are keeping those good records. You're keeping that activity separate. Your staff have been trained on what hat they need to wear and when they are doing that, and that you are paying for the right type of money is paying for the right type of program. Some of these organizations could be, if you're doing joint activities, they must be C3 permissible. Same thing with the lobbying or advocacy. When you're sharing logos or resources, it must be C3 permissible. Again, keep the C4s separate. the C4 political work separate. Some of the ways that C3s and C4s work together are on nonpartisan voter registration activity. It must be strictly nonpartisan. You're not referencing candidates. You're not referencing the parties. There's no suggestion of whom to vote for. You're making the service available to everyone. So after you've registered those voters, you want to make sure those voters get out to vote. Again, as long as you're keeping your message strictly nonpartisan, you're just educating the public on how they can vote, what are the deadlines. You're not referencing party or candidate. You're making the service available to everyone. Then that is a way that you C3s and C4s can work together and share their funds and getting out the vote. You also can engage in nonpartisan voter assistance, rides to the polls, voter protection, voter information. Here's where you want to check with your state regulations, because some of your states have their own specific regulations regarding how people can vote, regarding on whether or not you can give bottles of water to people who are waiting in line to vote. You want to make sure that you know your state guidelines, your state regulations on voting process. So last, just going to end up here. We're going to follow up just a few key takeaways and resources. You want to, when you are in a coalition, if you are engaging a coalition, making sure that everyone realizes that that the coalition has C3 permissible goals and activities, that their activities as C3 acceptable, that they are targeting a natural constituency or an underrepresented population, that the coalition, the affiliated organizations are protecting the C3 coalition members, and they respect the C3 coalition members and the amount of work that they can do. Next is you also want to make sure that, and this is why it's important that when you do programs that are sharing logos, when you have a C3 and C4 logo, that it is C3 permissible work. You're not creating misconceptions. You're keeping the C3, C4 separate, that you have an AFJ and an AFJ action logo, that there's no misperception on whose organization is doing what, and that the C3 is doing permissible C3 activity. Also, you want to make sure, again, that following those 4 principles, when you aren't an affiliated organization, you do have the you have your cost sharing agreement, you have your timesheets, you are really keeping track of who is doing what, and the right money is being paid for the right activity. Coalitions are a powerful tool. You can really, working in coalition, working in affiliation, you can really maximize your advocacy efforts. And we really encourage it. But you really need to keep in mind those 4 are 4 underlying principles and follow those. I'm going to stop my share, but I want to let you know about our rules of the game, and I'm going to follow up with the connection, the slides, the connection, and some other guidelines for this. And if you ever need to reach out to us, you can scan that QR code, reach out to us via email, or give us a call, and we are here to take your help.